agent here at the CSU Extension Office in Pueblo County. We also have Laura, who is our Family and Consumer Sciences agent. She'll be doing the using herbs and preserving herbs section. So I'll let her kind of introduce herself again when she gets started. But let's go ahead and get started talking about growing herbs. So we're going to first talk about growing herbs in the ground and then switch gears and talk about growing herbs in containers. And then we'll move on to Laura's sections on using herbs and preserving herbs. And at the end, we'll go over the herb box planting. I think on the call right now, just Kathy is a recipient of the kit. So Kathy, if you want to stay on at the end, we can answer any questions, guide you through what you have in the kits and things of that nature. So what is an herb? An herb can be defined as just about any type of plant. It can be a tree, a shrub, a vine. They can be perennial and last year after year. They can be annual and just grown for 1 year and not overwintered. They can be grown indoors. They can be grown outdoors, outdoors in containers, outdoors in the ground, indoors in containers. So there's tons and tons of options. Herbs are very flexible and the classification of an herb is pretty broad. So let's start off with ground production of herbs. When we're growing herbs in the ground, in our soil, the most important consideration is going to be light. So if you're starting a new herb garden, it's good to take a look around your landscape and see where is the sun during certain times of the day. If you already have an area that you're planting in, obviously, we kind of got to deal with what we've got. But hopefully that area or an area that you would choose has at least 6 hours of full direct sunlight per day. 6 hours in Colorado is considered to be full sun because, we're a little closer to the sun than other places. Other places might need more hours to be considered full sun, but 6 hours will do it here. If you're going to have shade at some point in the day, it's best to have it in the afternoon. It's hotter in the afternoon. Most plants will like a little break from that hot summer sun in the afternoon. So morning sun, afternoon shade is the best situation if you are planting a new area and you can get out there and see a place that has 6 hours shaded in the afternoon. That's going to be your best bet for a place for an outdoor herb garden. Ideally, you want to find a west or a south exposure. Those are going to be the best exposures where you're probably going to have enough sun to grow herbs. As far as soil goes, moist, well-draining soil is what you want. You want soil that'll hold enough moisture to stay moist, but that won't hold so much that it becomes soggy and you have standing water. That's just going to lead to a lot of different disease issues and things of that nature. So moist and well draining is definitely what we want. Soil testing is best. If you're unsure about what the status of your soil is, we can make guesses, but getting a soil test is the only sure way to know what is exactly going on in your soil. If you don't want to really spend the time or money to get your soil tested, I would recommend just mixing in a plant-based compost about 2 feet down for soil amendment. That should be a pretty general okay thing to do for most situations. Adding a plant-based compost is always a good idea. If you do want to get a soil test, we do have kits available at the extension office. You can get a hold of me after class and I can let you know how to get one, how it works. We can go over that. Most herbs and like plants in general, actually, most ideally want a soil pH of 6 to 6.5. That is not probably what you have in your native outdoor soil here in Colorado, for those of you who are local. Our pH is much higher in Pueblo, probably around the 7.5 to 8 region, but that's okay for most of these herbs. Most of them can acclimate to that higher pH. A couple of them actually would prefer that, and I'll tell you what those are. It's hard to lower your pH. There's a lot of things you can do, that you'll read about online, things you can put in that will lower your pH. but soils have natural buffers, and those buffers are there to keep the soil pH at what it is. So anything that you do is going to be short term. It's probably going to bounce back to that natural pH. Mixing in organic matter in the form of that plant-based compost over many years is a good way to kind of bring it down a little bit. But other than that, it's best to just kind of work with what you got. If you have a plant that requires a really low pH, probably just don't grow it here or grow it in a container. Make life easier. If you have perennial herbs in your garden, you should cover them with a layer of mulch before winter to protect their roots from frost heaving and to keep their moisture levels even during the winter. And then definitely get out there and water them through the winter and the fall. That will aid in root health. It will help them come back better and stronger the next year. And that doesn't only go for your perennial herbs, that goes for any of your perennial flowers, your lawn, trees, anything that is a perennial plant that you're hoping to come back the next year. Water it in the fall and winter, and you will see really good results the next spring. And feel free to type any questions in the chat, and I have a couple breaks built in where I'll get to check the chat and answer your questions. So as far as watering goes, it's hard to say how much exactly you need to water. It really depends on a lot of stuff. It depends on which herbs you have planted, how much sun your site is getting, the weather. It depends on your soil. So there's a lot that it depends on, but you want to go for moist, not soggy. That's the ideal situation that you're looking to go for. Most herbs that we would plant, most of the common ones, prefer a warm and actually kind of dry location. They don't want to be super soggy. That's going to cause a lot of problems. Some herbs like your mints, parsley, cress, things like that will want a little bit of a higher moisture level, still not soggy though. Always read the plant tag, do a little bit of research. If you're unsure, call the extension office, call the master gardeners, and we can help you figure out exactly what the specific herb needs. But most of the common ones are going to like it a little bit on the dry side. Diseases are pretty common in herbs, and most of them are spread by splashing water and by being kept too soggy. So if you can set up drip irrigation in your herb garden, that's going to be the best thing that you can do as far as watering goes. If you don't want to put in that time, effort, money in the front end to put in a drip irrigation system, just make sure that you're watering at the base of the plant, not over the top of the leaves. That will help to eliminate some of those disease issues that are caused by overhead watering. So when you're looking for your site to plant your herb garden, you really don't want somewhere that's getting hit by your sprinklers constantly. That's going to probably cause you some disease issues. As far as pruning goes, you probably will need to prune your outdoor herbs. Doing it in early spring for perennials helps to control growth, especially on woody herbs. Any time of the year, if you have a dead or a damaged or a diseased stem or portion of a plant, go ahead and get that off of there. It doesn't matter the time of year. But as far as controlling growth, early spring and midsummer are probably the best times to do that. Midsummer, you're going to go ahead and cut your branches back by 1/3 to 1/2, depending on how big your plants are. Of course, leave some greenery and growth nodules on the stem so they can continue to grow into the fall. Any herb that you're growing for the leaves, such as basil, rosemary, thyme, a lot of them we're growing for the leaves to use in our cooking. If they bloom, you want to just pinch those blooms off. The plant will put more energy into the blooms and it takes away from the flavor of the leaves. So go ahead and just pinch those blooms right off like this picture is showing here. As far as harvesting goes, you typically want to harvest in the morning on a day with no rain, kind of a dry day after the dew has dried on the plants. As far as perennial goes, you don't want to harvest more than 1/3 of the perennial plants at one time. That way they can keep growing and give you future harvests. Annuals, you can cut back to about 4 inches tall, of course, leaving some leaves and some stems so they can keep growing and give you more harvest in the future. And, a lot of them you can just kind of pick off, you're cooking some pasta sauce and you want to use some basil, you can just pick off like the 4 or 5 leaves that you need. That would be totally fine to do as well. So if there's any questions on ground production, I will check the chat really quick. I don't see anything so far. Feel free to type any questions that come up into the chat. And in the meantime, I will go ahead and get into container production of herbs. So the first thing to consider, of course, is choosing a container. And there are so many different types of containers made of so many types of materials. And, all of them are good in certain situations. They all have pros and they all have cons. It kind of just depends on what works for you and what you like. So let's go over some of the pros and cons of plastic. Let's start with plastic containers. The good things about plastic are, for one, they're lightweight. So if it's something you're going to be moving inside and outside, that's a pro for you. And they hold water really well, so they don't need to be watered as often. A con of plastic is that they tend to restrict air movement. Plastic is not very porous. And of course, we all know that plant roots need water, but we do sometimes forget that they also need oxygen. So the roots don't get quite as much oxygen in a plastic container because there's not as much moving through that container. So that could be a potential con. Clay, really good support, a really sturdy pot, good air movement. Clay tends to be more porous, so you're getting some air flow through to your roots. The cons are that they're very heavy and hard to move. So if it's something you're going to be moving around, clay might not be the best option. And because they're porous and have more air moving through, they tend to need watered more frequently. Same kind of things with wood. That's more porous, so good air movement, but more frequent watering. And also wood has the potential to rot. So it's kind of more of a short-term kind of pot. Ceramic is more along the lines of plastic. It holds water really well. Ceramic pots tend to be very decorative and nice looking, but most of the time they're glazed. So they can kind of restrict air movement just like a plastic pot would. As far as light goes in a container produced herb, if it's outside, west or south facing exposures are good. Inside, if you can find a west or south facing window, that will be best. If not, supplemental lighting may be needed. You can buy a grow light pretty cheap and just about anywhere these days. If you don't have a grow light or don't want to invest in one, 2 40-watt white fluorescent bulbs can be placed about a foot, maybe a half foot away from the plants. And you've got to leave it on about 14 to 16 hours per day to replicate the effects of a grow light, but that would work as well. And by the way, you will be getting these slides in a PDF form in a follow-up email. So you don't need to worry about remembering this or jotting this down. You'll get this and you can reference it whenever you need to. As far as containers go inside, especially, or if they have a grow light on one side of them, you need to rotate them periodically about a quarter turn so that light reaches all sides of the plant equally. As far as soil, potting mixes, soilless media is pretty common. On this picture, you can see components that would be included in a soilless media. They tend to be really lightweight, hold water and nutrients well, sometimes have some nutrients mixed in. So soilless media is great. Soil mixes are also available. It's best to look for a sterilized soil mix so that you know it's free of weed seeds or any potential pathogens. Just getting your native soil from outside is usually, around here anyway, kind of too heavy of a soil. Who knows what's in it? It may have diseases or weed seeds or who knows what components could be in it. So that's not usually recommended. As far as fertilizing go, you should mix in a controlled release fertilizer into your potting mix when you pot. And then about every week or two during the growing season, you can fertilize with the water soluble fertilizer. And normally the instructions there'll be instructions for outdoor plants and indoor plants. So depending on if you're keeping your containers outdoors or indoors, just follow the instructions on the fertilizer that you choose to go with. Again, watering is super dependent on the plant, and then in this case, the material of the container, where it's at, the environment, is it inside or outside? So you kind of got to just get used to your plant, you want maybe like the top inch to 2 inches to stay pretty moist and of course not get soggy. You want your containers to have drainage always. Any container you planted needs to have drainage holes. If you have herbs that have similar water requirements, they can be planted together in the same pot. And of course, if you're keeping your plants outdoors, they're going to need to be watered more frequently than an indoor herb plant would be. Inside, containers should be monitored for pests and diseases that can be very, very common in indoor herbs, especially if we're overwatering. So try not to overwater and then just monitor for any kind of pests or diseases going on. You don't want those inside of your home. So now I'm going to go over a few specific herbs that you can try, and there's a ton of info on these slides. I'm not going to go over all of it. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights of a few of these herbs so we have plenty of time to talk about using and preserving herbs. But please remember, you're going to get the slides. You can reference these and go back to this plethora of information anytime that you might need it. Chives, a very popular one to try, kind of an oniony type of herb. They have beautiful little flower heads that come up in late spring and early summer. They are hardy outdoors, so you can grow them outdoors or, of course, indoors. They grow well indoors as well. You should harvest the outside leaves first. Those are the older leaves, and then kind of work your way in. Harvest whenever you need it, but it's best to harvest kind of frequently to keep them growing well and not getting overcrowded. Things to look out for are powdery mildew, downy mildew, rusts, and we'll go over a few diseases here at the end as well. With most all of these, I won't say this on all of them, but you need to carefully monitor the amount of water that you apply. If you're overwatering, your chances of disease are much, much more likely. So don't overwater, let your soil dry out a little bit in between, stick your finger down to about your first knuckle. And when it's dry down that far, that's when you need to water. You don't want to cause diseases by keeping them too moist. Cilantro is kind of a double bang for your buck kind of herb because the leaves are cilantro, and then if you let it flower and go to seed, then the seeds are coriander. So you can get two herbs out of the one plant. It's going to be an annual outdoors. Flowers in the summer, so you can let it go to flower. Once it flowers, the leaves won't be quite as flavorful. So if you want to harvest the seed, just know that you're probably not going to have tasty leaves once it starts to flower. Harvest the leaves when they're young and tender. The coriander, the seeds, you want to harvest them when half of them are still green and the other half have ripened to gray. And then the other half will kind of ripen after you get them out. Caterpillars might feed on cilantro, and we'll talk about caterpillars in a little bit here too. Dill is a great one to try. It can be a little bit flimsy, so it might need staking or just plant it somewhere where it's kind of protected from the wind. It doesn't love to be transplanted, so it's best to start it from seed. If you're very careful, you can transplant it. It has a lot of stuff, different diseases and different caterpillars that could get onto it. So just monitor that moisture and monitor it for caterpillars. Lavender is a really awesome plant to try, really common in perennial gardens as more of like a flower garden type of situation that also smells really good and you can use inside. English lavender does well here. It's hardy to zone 5, which we are in Pueblo, so it's kind of on the border of its range there. French and Spanish lavenders aren't really hardy. They don't overwinter, but you can grow them as annuals and move them inside if you want to overwinter them, or just grow them as annuals in your landscape. If you do want to plant an English lavender and have it overwinter, research has shown that fall planted lavender survives better, establishes more quickly, and produces more flowers. So I would wait until mid to late September to plant a perennial lavender outdoors in your landscape. It's very drought tolerant. You're going to need to water it a little bit more when it's first planted so it can get established, but you definitely don't want to overwater it because it's going to be pretty xeric once you get it established. Mint is a very aggressive grower. It can take over a garden, so you can plant it along a border with deep edging, or put it in a container that you then plant into a ground, or just plant it in containers to kind of keep it under control, because it will definitely spread. If you have it in a container, you'll need to divide it about at least every 3 years, probably more if it's pretty happy. You can divide it in the spring or fall, harvest it whenever you need it, before flowering, of course, or just go ahead and pinch off those flowers like we talked about. Oregano is one that actually will like a slightly alkaline soil, which we have around here. So this is one that you will probably do really well actually in the ground in your native soil. It's hardy in zones 4 through 9, so probably won't overwinter, but you can plant it in a container and bring it indoors. Harvest the leaves anytime you need them for cooking or whatever you're using it for. And parsley is the other one that will definitely tolerate a slightly alkaline soil. So another one that will do great in the ground, but also does great in containers. It can be allelopathic, which means that it sends out a component that will potentially harm other plants. So you'll want it alone in a container. This isn't one you want to plant with other plants in a container. Tons and tons of different caterpillars and pests love to eat parsley. So just be aware of that. Rosemary, it is perennial, but it can be a little bit tender. A lot of people bring it inside, so they grow it in containers over the winter, or just grow it as an annual because it can be a little bit finicky to overwinter. If you do have it in a pot, it'll probably need to be repotted or divided pretty frequently. You don't need to really fertilize it too much. It's a nice, hardy, woody plant. After it flowers, you can give it a dose of fertilizer. Sage, another great one to try. If it's in the ground, you'll want to fertilize it once in the spring and once in the first week of June. So like about now, if you have it in the ground. In containers, you'll want to fertilize it about monthly. Of course, don't overwater it. It does have some different diseases that it's susceptible to, mostly if it's being overwatered. But you can grow it from seeds, grow it from cuttings. Nice one to try. Basil, a personal favorite of mine. I always love to have a basil plant in my kitchen because there's so many things I like to use it for, and it just smells really good. This is one that'll flower, and you can just go ahead and pinch those flowers right off, so the leaves will stay very tasty for you. Most of your harvesting will be done during the summer. In hot climates, like such as here in Pueblo, you can harvest, like almost completely harvest it about every 3 weeks. I like to just kind of harvest it as I need it. I use it enough that's usually good enough. Tarragon is kind of an interesting one. It's actually in the daisy family, whereas a lot of these that we've talked about have been in the mint family. It's pretty drought tolerant, hardy in zones 3 through 7, so you can definitely grow it here. It hardly ever goes to seed in the garden. So if you want to collect seeds, probably won't be able to from your garden, but you can take cuttings in the summer, absolutely. Pretty disease resistant as well. It can get rust, which there's not really anything you can do about. You kind of have to discard it, but there's not a lot of problems that we see with tarragon. Thyme, this one's a perennial in the mint family. It's great to use as like a ground cover even in a flower bed or something like that, if you don't want to just grow it in an herb garden. It is pretty drought tolerant as well, so it'll do great around here. Definitely don't want to overwater it for that reason. Prune it heavily in early spring, and then it'll grow as a beautiful ground cover for you all summer long. So now we'll go over a few diseases and pests, just a few. There's a lot of stuff that could come up, but these are just some of the common ones that you might see. Let me see. I don't see anything in the chat right now. So powdery mildew is a pretty common fungal disease that we see around here. You'll see kind of these spots or patches of white or gray on the leaves. You might see tiny round structures on the stem that are white, and they'll turn brown or black as it progresses. Really common when plants are too crowded, when they're overhead watered, when they're overwatered. So try to increase airflow. Don't water overhead. Don't let sprinklers be hitting your plants, and try to not overwater. Probably best just to remove or destroy any infected plants. You can also use neem oil or sulfur to try to get ahead of it as well. And you'll need to apply that every 2 weeks until you start to see some improvement. And of course, follow the instructions on the label of any product that you were to use. Make sure that you are using something labeled for edible plants and that you're paying attention to harvest intervals. How long after you use the product can you consume the plant? And that's all on the labels of the product that you would get. Fusarium wilt is another fungal disease. You might see your leaves wilting and yellowing between the veins. Again, same kind of causes: overcrowded plants and overwatered plants, overhead watering. Those are what causes this. There's lots of different fungicides that you can use that are make sure it's labeled for Fusarium wilt. And of course, make sure you follow the instructions. Caterpillars are probably the biggest insect problem when it comes to herbs. Many herbs will be eaten by many different kinds of caterpillars. You can pick them off and move them, or whatever you feel the need to do with them. You can cover your plants with an insect barrier fabric. One of my favorite methods is to plant things that they can have. So if you see that the caterpillars are all over your parsley, plant some other parsley, move it farther out in your yard, pick the caterpillars off and move them to that other parsley. Let them have that. There's no reason that they would move to your parsley if you give them their own. So that's actually a pretty good method when it comes to controlling caterpillars. You can buy BT Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a product that has a bacteria that infects caterpillars. You can use that on your plants to get rid of them, or spinosad. They're both organic, but of course you still need to read the label and make sure you're using them properly and that you're paying attention to those harvest intervals. And then grasshoppers are very difficult to control. They'll feed on a lot of different herbs and pretty much just about like any plant, actually, if they need to. But they're so mobile that even if you're doing something to control them, they can move in from your neighbor's yard or across town. So if you start to see small grasshoppers early in the season, start thinking about your plan then, because they're much easier to control when they're young and small. This is a table that, of course, you'll get in the notes that I'll send you in a follow-up email, but it has a lot of different options for controlling caterpillars, things that you can use on edibles, things that are organic, such as the Nolo bait. So you can take a look at this and see which of these options might work for you if you are battling grasshoppers. But like I said, they can be really hard. And the good thing is they're cyclical. There's bad bad grasshopper years and good grasshopper years. So it's not going to be something that you probably experience year after year after year, luckily. So what final questions do we have on growing herbs? I will wait a second and give you a chance to type anything into the chat that you might have before Laura gets started. Yeah, so parsley, in the chat, you'll see there's a question on companion planting. Parsley should usually be planted alone because it can be allelopathic and prevent other herbs from growing. Most other herbs can be planted together. You just want to make the water requirements are the best thing to consider. So like thyme and oregano are both kind of drought tolerant, so they would go good together. You wouldn't want to plant thyme or oregano with like something like maybe a dill that wants a little bit more water. I would say the water requirements are the main things to keep in mind. And then of course, keep parsley alone. Just that's probably best so it doesn't kill the other plants. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk about using and preserving herbs. If something comes up on growing herbs and you want to type it in the chat, I'll definitely be monitoring it while Laura does her portion of the presentation. So feel free to type that in. And other than that, I will turn it over to Laura. And it looks like you were on mute there, Laura, and it's your notes slides. I know that's hard to see on your end sometimes.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So like Cherie said, my name is Laura Griffin. I am the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County. And I will be talking about some ways to preserve your herbs once you've grown them, and some ways to use them as well. All right, so to get started, just some basic definitions for you of herbs versus spices, because sometimes these get used interchangeably and can be a little bit confusing. So herbs, which is what we're mostly talking about today, they are plants where the leaves provide the flavor or the part that we're using. So it's typically going to be that the flavor comes from the leaves and they can be used either fresh or in a dried variety. Typically, herbs are going to have a little bit more of a mild flavor to them, and they grow really well in temperate regions. So here in Colorado, we can grow a lot of different varieties of herbs. Spices, on the other hand, the flavor is going to come from basically any other part of that plant. So it can come from the seeds, it can come from the roots, a fruit, flowers, or even bark in some cases. So in this photo here, we are looking at a few cinnamon trees, and that cinnamon actually comes from the bark of those trees. Spices, when compared to herbs, are typically going to have a stronger, more pungent flavor to them. And they grow better in a tropical region. So here in Colorado, we're probably not going to have a lot of luck growing a lot of spices. We're going to have to stick with those herbs. But for those of you that maybe live in a little bit warmer climate with a little bit more humidity, you might be able to grow some of those spices. All right, so we have basically three main uses of herbs. The first, of course, is going to be culinary, so the use of herbs in cooking. The second is going to be aromatic, so this is using the scent of different herbs to provide scent to products such as soaps or lotions or perfumes, something like that. And then finally, we have ornamental use, which typically are herbs that have, brightly colored flowers or foliage to them are going to be considered ornamental. But truly any herb can be ornamental if you like the look of it. So there's nothing that says that you can't grow an herb just for ornamental purposes. You certainly don't have to harvest them to use in culinary or aromatic practices. And while these uses are the three that we typically see, these are not hard and fast categories. We don't have herbs that, specifically fit into one of these categories, and that's the end of discussion. These are very fluid categories. Some herbs may fall into one of these categories. Some herbs may fall into all three. And some people may have different opinions on which categories each herb falls into. So for example, a lot of times lavender is going to be considered, aromatic as well as ornamental. But some people, maybe they don't like the look of that and they want to use basil as an ornamental. So like I said, very flexible, but just a few ideas of uses for your herbs. All right, so some information on harvesting for preserving specifically. So these rules are specifically if you're planning on preserving your herbs for future use. It's a little bit less strict if you're just using it for fresh use and just picking them and you're going to use them that day or something. But Cherie mentioned it's always best to harvest in the morning on a dry, sunny day after the dew has dried. So morning is going to be our preference, but for sure we want to harvest no later than early afternoon because transpiration occurs more heavily later in the day, and that's going to lower our aromatic qualities as the moisture leaves our plants. So that's going to lose our aromatic qualities as well as overall flavor. We also want to harvest the leaves just before the flowers bloom. So in all things food preservation, we always want to err on the side of a little bit underripe rather than overripe or even fully ripe. And that goes for everything from fruits to vegetables to herbs. So we want to harvest our flowers before the blooms fully open. And we want to gather seeds as the colors change from a greenish color to that brownish gray color that we see when seeds are fully mature. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different preservation methods. The first of which is freezing herbs. And I think, when we think about preserving herbs, my mind anyway immediately goes to drying them. We see a lot more of that dried herb product out there on the market. But freezing herbs can actually be a really good option. And there's a couple different methods that we can do this. So the first is what we call the tray method. And with any food preservation that we're going to be doing, we always want to start with the freshest, healthiest leaves. So we want to make sure that they have good color, that they have good consistency and texture. They're not too damaged or starting to turn brown. Again, we want to always err on that side of underripe rather than overripe. And we're going to go ahead and wash those leaves off really well, pat them dry. And then all you're going to do for this method is basically spread the sprigs or leaves in an individual layer on either a small tray or a cookie sheet. Really anything that's going to be freezer safe is fine. And you're going to go ahead and pop that into the freezer. And these should freeze reasonably quickly. So I would say within 6 to 8 hours, you can come back to them. And they should be completely frozen solid. So as long as they're totally frozen, then you can go ahead and transfer them into any airtight freezer safe container. So that can be these Ziploc bags like we see here. They can be freezer safe Tupperwares or Pyrex containers, or even mason jars are a really good freezer storage option as well. But the nice thing about kind of doing that flash freezing on the tray is it's going to individually freeze all of these different sprigs or leaves before we store them for long term. So when we're going back into the freezer and we want to just grab a couple leaves at a time, they're going to come apart much easier because they're individually frozen, rather than if we were to just throw them all in that container together and freeze them. If we do that, they're going to freeze into a giant block of herbs. And it's going to be much more difficult to just grab a couple sprigs for our recipe that day and put the rest in the freezer. So most likely we'll have to thaw the whole thing out, remove a couple of those leaves, refreeze them. And over time, that's going to really decrease our quality, not only in our flavor, but also our texture and consistency. All right, so our other option for freezing is actually freezing in ice cube trays. And I think this is kind of one of the best kept secrets of food preservation. Not a lot of people think to do this, but it's actually a really great idea. And there's a lot of different things that you can do with it. So again, we're going to start with our washed and dried leaves. And all you're going to do is either stuff about 2 to 3 individual leaves or a spoonful of chopped up herbs into each ice cube container, depending on the size of the leaf. You're going to fill those trays with about halfway with water, making sure that those leaves are as submerged as possible, and then go ahead and pop that into the freezer. Again, 6 to 8 hours. Once that's mostly frozen, you'll go ahead and remove it. Fill the tray all the way up with water. So fill the remaining portion, place it back into the freezer, and then freeze solid. So I would just say, leave it in there overnight or maybe for 24 hours. And once those are completely frozen solid, just like with our leaves, we can go ahead and transfer those into our long-term storage. So again, anything that's going to be freezer safe and airtight is totally fine. But the nice thing about this is it gives you these little herb cubes. So if you are making a recipe with, one herb, or if you're really organized, you can actually mix herbs in each of these cubes. And then when you go to make the recipe, you can just take one out of the freezer and go ahead and pop it in your soup or your stew, pasta sauce, anything like that. Everything is already pre-measured out. And like I said, you can mix herbs or you can make a variety of different herb cubes to use throughout the year. And you're getting that really fresh flavor from when those herbs are at their peak ripeness all year long. So that's kind of a fun idea. You can also use them as ice cubes themselves. So during the summer months, if you're looking to infuse your water or lemonade or iced tea with a little bit of flavor, such as basil or mint, anything like that, you can go ahead and pop a couple of those in your drink and it'll kind of give you a new flavor to try there as well. All right, so as long as you are freezing herbs in an airtight, moisture-proof container, the flavor is going to keep pretty well for about 6 to 8 months. After that, we do start to see a decline in overall quality, but freezing is actually going to retain more flavor than other preservation methods. So if maintaining flavor is really important to you, I would highly recommend the freezing option. With drying herbs, we're concentrating the flavor initially, so it's a little bit stronger at first, but because we're removing all of that moisture, the flavor is actually going to dissipate faster over time. All right, so our second option is drying herbs. And again, there are a couple different ways we can do this. So the first is going to be air drying. And this photo here is a picture of the hanging air dry method. Air drying is going to work best for some of our more sturdy herbs. So herbs such as rosemary, sage, thyme, summer savory, and parsley are going to air dry the best without having to use an actual dehydrator. And essentially all you're going to do with the hanging method is tie them at the base into small bundles. And then you're either going to use a clothespin or string or something like that to tie them to this hanging device. And I will tell you that air drying is not the fastest method for sure. So if you're doing this here in Colorado in the summer where our moisture levels are pretty low and our heat is pretty high, it could still take anywhere from 7 to 10 days to fully dry out some of these herbs. So if you're in an area where the humidity is higher, you're looking at even longer for that to occur. You can also do the tray method with air drying. So just like with the freezer, we're going to put our leaves in a single layer on a tray or plate. And basically we're just going to let them air dry over time. And with this, we want to make sure that we're placing them in an area that is going to be, get good air circulation and good airflow, but not too much. So if you place them under a fan or your air conditioning unit, these leaves are pretty lightweight, so it's likely they're going to blow all over your house. If you leave them outside, same thing. If a gust of wind comes up, then you probably lost all of your herbs all over your yard. So this can be a little bit challenging to find the right place. If you're doing the hanging method, at least they're a little bit more secure. You can do that inside or outside, but again, you want to make sure that they're protected from a lot of the weather. If you're having a lot of rain or thunderstorms, anything like that, obviously that's going to be a huge hindrance to the drying process. And because these leaves sit out or hang out for such a long period of time, and they're very exposed to either the elements or the dirt and dust and dander in your home, we would not recommend using an air drying method for herbs that you plan on cooking with. So this is perfectly fine if you're using them for aromatic purposes or ornamental purposes. You want to use dried sage in your home, or you want to dry some lavender to put in a vase, something like that is totally fine. But for food safety reasons, we would not recommend using this method for culinary herbs. If you do want to use dried herbs for culinary purposes, highly recommend investing in a dehydrator. The dehydrator is going to be the fastest and easiest way to get really high quality dried herbs. And the reason for that is that it's a very controlled environment. So you don't have to worry about that exposure to, again, any of that dirt or dust or dander that may be in your home. They're not sitting outside for long periods of time. They're getting very consistent temperature and airflow. So they're going to dry the most evenly and the quickest as well. There's lots of different dehydrators out there on the market. So if you're looking to invest in a dehydrator mostly for herbs, you definitely don't need anything fancy or expensive. Herbs have very low moisture content. They're very thin, so they're going to dry quickly and easily regardless of the dehydrator that you have. If you're looking to maybe dehydrate some other foods as well, you might look at a slightly better dehydrator. But you can certainly do a lot of really good dehydrating without spending a fortune on a dehydrator. Just a little bit of background information on dehydrators. There's basically two main types. And the only difference between the two of them is where the air source is located and the direction of the airflow. So in this photo here, we have a dehydrator where the fan is either located in the base or the lid, and the airflow is going to be vertical. So because of that, the trays that are located closer to the fan are going to be getting a little bit higher airflow. So it's not going to be totally 100% consistent throughout the trays. You can kind of combat that by rotating your trays as you go throughout the day to make sure that they're all getting those different distances between the fan. But these are going to be our cheaper options. So you can buy these types of dehydrators for as low as $30 or $40. The other type of dehydrator, the fan is located in the back of the machine and the airflow is horizontal. So all of the trays are getting exact even airflow and consistency throughout the whole process. So you don't have to worry about rotating your trays. It can give you a little bit higher quality product. But again, if you're mostly concerned about herbs, I wouldn't worry about investing in one of those. Some of those can run up to $100 or $200 depending on the size that you're looking at. But essentially, you just want to make sure when you're using your dehydrator, all of them are a little bit different. They all have slightly different settings. But typically with herbs, we're going to set our heat to somewhere between 95 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're in an area with a lot of humidity, you might have to increase that up to about 125 degrees. But my best recommendation is to just follow the guidelines for your specific dehydrator. So they all come with a recipe guide and instructions, and those will give you the best result for that specific dehydrator. All right, and then our final drying option is going to be microwave drying. So this is a method that is only appropriate for herbs because they are so thin and they have such a low moisture content. We can't use the microwave drying option for any other types of foods that we might want to dehydrate. But with the microwave drying, this is going to work best again with our smaller leaves or herbs like we see there with the parsley. But you're basically just going to take a microwave safe plate. You're going to place a paper towel over that and then put our herbs in a single layer like we see there. Place another paper towel over that and pop it in the microwave for about 1 minute. You're going to remove the plate and check to see if they're dry. I will tell you they will not be dry, but we want to make sure we're checking them every so often. And so then we're going to put another microwave safe plate on top of that and flip them over. So you'll remove the top plate, place them back in the microwave for, again, 30 seconds to a minute, and take them out, check them again. And we're just going to repeat this process until they are fully dry. So I can tell you here in Colorado, this is usually going to require about 5 to 7 minutes of microwave time. But we don't want to put our herbs strictly in the microwave and put them in for 5 minutes straight, because that will actually cook them rather than dry them. So we want to kind of give them that break and make sure that they get that airflow in between, and that we're flipping them over every so often to get that even drying as well. And we can check our herbs to make sure that they're dry when the stems break cleanly. So we don't want them to bend at all. We just want them to break evenly and cleanly. And when the herb leaves crumble to the touch. So that's kind of how we tell if they are fully dry. And like I said, usually about 5 to 7 minutes of actual microwave time in 30-second to a minute increments. If you are in a place of higher humidity, it probably will take a little bit longer. All right, so storing dried herbs. Just like with the freezer storing, we want to store our dried herbs in airtight containers. And we want to make sure that we are labeling and dating these containers. So it's always a good idea just to label what each container has in it, especially when we dry some of these herbs, they can look very, very similar. So we want to make sure we know what's in it and give us a date just for reference for food safety purposes. Herbs are going to retain the most flavor if you store the leaves whole and crush them when you are ready to use them, as opposed to crushing them and storing them in a crushed form. If we see any signs of mold, obviously we want to discard those immediately. We want to store these in a cool, dry place away from direct sunlight. And typically dried herbs are going to be best used within a year. And so, like I said, the flavor overall is going to be maintained a lot better when freezing. But these will be safe to use for up to a year, and they do maintain a certain amount of flavor. Using them a little bit earlier before that year mark is going to give us our best flavor when using dried herbs. And then just kind of a handy conversion for you. So if you're cooking with dried herbs and you need fresh, or you want to use fresh and the recipe calls for dried, about 1 teaspoon of crumbled dried leaves equals 1 tablespoon of fresh leaves. So if you want to use fresh instead of dried, or vice versa, you can use that conversion. Essentially, because they are dried, that flavor is concentrated a lot more. So it takes a lot less of the dried leaves to achieve the same flavor as the fresh. All right, so I'm just going to go through a few of our more popular herbs, how to harvest them, and some popular uses for them. So first is basil, which is probably one of our most popular herbs. You want to harvest it about 6 weeks after planting, and we're just going to cut the leaves for drying just before the flowers open. And again, this is a very popular culinary herb. We can use it fresh, we can use it dried in a variety of dishes. Basil is very popular in Italian dishes. So it's actually the main ingredient in pesto sauce, if you're interested in making that from scratch. And it's one of the main components of caprese salad as well, which is a really nice fresh summer salad involving tomato, mozzarella, basil, and a balsamic vinaigrette. Dill, you're going to pick as flowers are opening. And again, the seeds when they are flat and brown. Dill obviously is one of our most common flavors for pickled products. So that can include pickles themselves, pickled green beans, sauerkraut, or pickled beets. And dill is also very popular to flavor Mediterranean dishes. So you'll find that dill flavoring in a lot of their dishes, including, poultry, fish, some of their couscous or carbohydrate dishes as well. Parsley is pretty simple. You can just cut the leaves off whenever they're a suitable size that you would like to use, depending on how much you need for that day. Parsley is one of our most common garnishes. So it's got those really pretty flowery leaves to them, a really bright green color. So we'll see this on the side of a lot of dishes just as a presentation aspect. But it can also be used as a flavoring as well. And most of our herbs really don't have a lot of nutritional value. But as far as herbs go, parsley actually has pretty high amounts of vitamin A, vitamin C, and iron as well. So just those are some kind of fun facts about parsley. Parsley typically pairs well with meats or seafoods, and it pairs really well with a fresh squeeze of lemon. So kind of that acidic, sour flavor of the lemon with the parsley goes really well with a variety of different meats. Chives, again, we're just going to cut the leaves when they are suitable size and depending on how much we need. And chives are basically providing a subtle onion-like flavor. So if you like the flavor of onion, but maybe you want something a little bit more subtle or a little bit less strong, chives are a really good option. You can use them in pretty much anything that you would use onion in. So you can use them in different soups or stews. You can use them on baked or mashed potatoes, as well as in your eggs or on top of your eggs are some really good options. Rosemary, again, you're just going to harvest the fresh leaves. Rosemary is very popular for flavoring a variety of meat dishes as well. Rosemary is one of our most aromatic and pungent of all the herbs. It kind of has this lemony pine flavor to it that pairs really well with thyme. So we'll see in a lot of recipes this use of rosemary and thyme together. But it's a very versatile herb. So like I said, it works really well on a variety of meats. But it can also be used in things such as tomato sauce, pizza, and it's also baked into or on top of bread a lot of times. If you see those herb crusted breads, a lot of times that will have rosemary on it. Sage, we're going to pick the leaves before or at blooming and cut back the stems after blooming. Sage is very popular for aromatic purposes. And overall, the flavor is slightly bitter, but it's used a lot of times in stuffing. So for our Thanksgiving stuffing or other poultry stuffings, it can flavor pork and fish really well. And it's also one of our main ingredients in sausage. Mint is kind of a fun one because there are like a million different varieties of flavors. So we have everything from traditional mint to spearmint to chocolate mint, orange mint, lots of different options out there. Mint is used to flavor things such as teas, oils for gum and candy. They also use it to for aromatic purposes in soaps, and they flavor some liqueurs with it as well. And then cilantro, again, we're going to harvest the fresh leaves, and cilantro is one of our most versatile herbs. It has a very distinct flavor to it. So you kind of find people either love cilantro or they hate it. It's probably one of the most controversial herbs, if you will, as far as people's palates for it. But it does add that really distinct flavor to a lot of Mexican food dishes, such as salsas. It can be used in different soups. It can be used in curries. It can be used in salads. Again, that's going to add a very distinct flavor. And can be used in different dressings as well as to flavor meats such as fish and chicken. All right, so that is all that we have prepared for you today. This is our contact information if you guys have questions in the future about anything we've gone over or anything else regarding herbs. You can always feel free to shoot us an email with any of that. We do have a short poll for you guys that I will pull up, and then I will start answering questions. If you have any more questions about the growing side as well, feel free to put those in the chat and we will answer all of those to the best of our ability. Let's see here. Poll. All right, so just a really quick poll. We would appreciate if you would answer. All right, awesome. Looks like everybody filled that out. All right, so let me take a look at the chat here. It looks like we have a couple questions about freezing herbs in olive oil rather than water. And yep, definitely you can do that. I would say the olive oil is not necessarily going to hold up as well over time. So if you're looking to, use all of these within 3 to 4 months, that would be totally fine. But the water is going to hold up just a little bit better in the freezer over those 6 to 9 months if you're looking to really preserve how long that's going to last. All right, so if nobody else has any questions, you will all receive a follow-up email by the end of this week, and it will include a copy of all the slides we went over today. So you'll get all the information that we went over today on the PowerPoints. It will also include a direct link to this recording. So if you guys want to watch any parts of this over again, we will have that available for the next 30 days. That you can go back and watch any parts of this. And for anyone who registered but was unable to attend today, they will be able to watch this class in its entirety as well. All right, so with that, if nobody else has any questions, thank you all so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and be on the lookout for that email that will be coming later this week. Thank you, everyone.